I'm Peter Ramsey. I'm one of the directors on Spider-Man Into the Spiderverse, and I'm here in Turin for the View conference. I always feel like I get a lot more credit than I deserve for Spiderverse because really I was just part of an incredible team of artists. Beyond just the directors and producers and writers, there were like 800 of us who came together to work on this movie and make it what it was. From VFX, animators, to the art department, editorial, you name it. So many people kind of worked and struggled together on this movie, and they always look easy after they're done, but in reality, we worked through a lot of doubt and uncertainty. But I learned so much on this movie. I've been in the business for a long time, and this is one of the greatest learning experiences I've ever had.
Spider-Man Into the Spiderverse was your first experience as a director. Did you like this role?
I really like directing a lot. I like being able to shape the story that way, and you can do that as a story artist too. But when you're a director, you're looking at the whole movie, and a lot of different aspects of the movie. So having a little more influence on more of the movie is something that I really like a lot.
You have worked as a storyboard artist on both animation and live action. Which one do you prefer?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know that I prefer either one. They're both different, but they're both filmmaking. They're both storytelling. They're both cinema. So for me, both forms are just as valid. They're just different media, and I like both of them. I want to go back and work in live action again, but that's just because I've been away from it for so long. I still love animation, would like to keep working in that as well.
Tell us about your education and your path in the industry.
I don't really have much formal education when it comes to art or film. I'm mostly self-taught. How did I get into the industry? I realized, I was actually in college in Los Angeles, was studying fine art. But I realized part of the way through that it wasn't really what I was really interested in. What I was really interested in was telling stories with pictures. I had drawn all my life. Thought maybe I'd be a comic book artist, maybe I'd be an illustrator. But what I was really getting interested in filmmaking. And so I found out about the craft of storyboarding, and I realized it might be a way for me to find a way into movie making. Because I didn't have any connections to the industry. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't even know if it was possible for me to get a job in the movie industry. But I knew I had the skill of drawing, and I knew enough about film storytelling to be able to put a few images together. So I got lucky and found an agency that represented storyboard artists for advertising, and they were just moving into representing people for film. So I was able to sign on with them, and my career just kind of started to roll from there. But the big question that everyone had, and I know the question that I first had, probably a lot of you guys had, was, why another Spider-Man? This character has been beloved for 50, 60 years, kind of all over the world. There's been many movies, many cartoons, many good movies. He's been serviced really well as a character on the big screen. So the idea of doing yet another version of the Spider-Man story, it was kind of tough. It was like, why? How can we say something new? And it wasn't even just a creative question. It was also a practical one. Because like I said, there's been a lot of other Spider-Man movies. How's this one going to stand out?
What do you want to tell in a story?
For me, I know the thing that interests me the most probably is emotion. Finding the emotion of a story or creating emotion. Whether it's in a relationship between characters or whether it's, the story of a character as they change over the course of the movie. But when you can create actual emotion, I think that's the thing that gets me the most involved and interested in a story, because, that's something that, it's something that Yeah, idea. You know, intellectual ideas are interesting, but when you get something that you have an emotional response to, there's something mysterious and really kind of powerful about that I love.
And one of the things that became really clear to me was the primary question that you have to ask yourself at every step in the process, and that guides you in making all your creative choices. And the question is, what story are you telling? On every level, no matter how small the decision, and how something looks in the movie, it could be wardrobe, it could be the color of a chair, the background, the design of the character, the dialogue, what the actual actions are. No matter what it is, it all comes down to finding the best way to express the ideas and themes of your movie. So you're constantly asking yourself at every step, what story are you telling? And on this movie, where we've made so many choices, so many hundreds of thousands of choices, that idea became more and more clear and important to me.
What did you want to communicate in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and did you achieve it?
Yeah, very much so. You know, the Phil Lord, who was one of our producers and wrote the initial drafts of the script, had written a treatment very early on that I felt really captured something special with the story of Miles. I mean, there was already from the very beginning, there was a real emotion and a real vision to it that all of us felt we wanted to try to achieve in the movie, you know. And I think we did it. It feels like we did it. But I just remember that being there from the very beginning, and that was the thing that I always kept with me as we were working on the movie.
So, it's a new Spider-Man, it's Miles Morales, it's Brooklyn, it's all that stuff, but it's still a Spider-Man movie. And that means there's certain things that you probably need to do that the audience expects and loves. And of course, we love our audience, so we didn't want to stint on any of that stuff. But the idea is, again, you know, this was like a remix of the classic idea of Spider-Man. So we're going to be taking all these very familiar elements and trying to honor them as best we could, but putting a new spin on them. And hopefully, in the end, we as we went along, and again, a lot of these things, we didn't have the solutions to begin with, and sometimes we didn't even have the exact question to begin with. But as we went along, we started realizing, oh, this is what this is. Oh, this is what this is trying to be. And you're going on instinct, and things are starting to bubble up out of the fabric of the movie. And here, the idea was, you know what? It's a movie about a new Spider-Man, but it's a movie about Spider-Man and the idea of Spider-Man and how strong that is and how it translates over any number of characters. So one obvious surface thing is that these trappings of Spider-Man means Spider-Man bad guys. So it's all the classic villains. You know, we've got the Kingpin, all these guys, but they're in slightly tweaked alternate universe guises and sort of bent to fit the needs of our story. Our Kingpin, he's based on the Kingpin, kind of designed by Bill Sienkiewicz, a classic comic book artist, who did a version of the Kingpin that was just this massive shape with a tiny head, and he was just supposed to be this kind of overwhelming wall of a man who was impossible to beat and completely corrupted. And in our movie, the Kingpin, he's got a subplot about his family. In much the way that Miles wants to protect and loves his family, the Kingpin has like a darker, more selfish version of the same thing. So he kind of rhymes with Miles in that way, very much tied to him. We also had a new version of Dr. Octopus, who was voiced by a brilliant actress, Katherine Hahn, who we just loved. And Doc Ock, we actually changed the whole gender of this character to, again, suggest this is an alternate universe, this is a new take. And it just allowed us to take this character in different places. And she became a portrait of a character who is, in a way, the flip side of a Spider-Man. And a Spider-Man is with great power comes great responsibility. Doc Ock, with her quest for to discover the ultimate secrets of the multiverse and reality for her own ends, to the point where she's even willing to make a deal with somebody as bad as the Kingpin. Hers was kind of, with great power, you don't have to have any responsibility. That kind of ties her to Miles, and she as a character, she's the doorway to the idea of the multiverse. There's the Green Goblin, who's a classic Spider-Man villain, who in Miles' universe is much more of a monster. So we leaned into the idea he's a gigantic monster. He's an ogre. He's as much of a monster as we could make him. There's the Scorpion, a new take on him. There's Tombstone. These, once again, classic Spider-Man bad guys, kind of bent and reshaped to fit our story. And then there's the Prowler. And the Prowler is the most important of the bad guys because, for those of you who've seen the movie, spoiler alert for those of you who haven't, the Prowler turns out to be the person that Miles probably is closest to in the world, which is his Uncle Aaron. And he is based on a classic Marvel character from comics like back in the 70s, and he was later updated in the comics in Miles' universe. So in the comics, the version of Uncle Aaron in the Miles universe is kind of closer to the version of Uncle Aaron that's in our movie. But of course, we continued to take a few liberties to fit him into the size of our movie. But you can see he's sort of this kind of street version of Batman. He's sort of, again, much like Miles, he's a guy who is existing in a very real world and has kind of outsized powers and abilities. We went through a lot of design work on him, going from like more Star Wars-y versions to more like second-rate Batman versions, and we eventually ended up with something that was kind of close to the original comics, and we changed the colors and made it purple because purple was cooler. Basically, we wanted him to be like an executioner, like this ghost, this spirit of death that was chasing Miles through the movie. And the thing that's really chasing Miles is this terrible truth that his uncle, the person he thought he could trust most, is actually the person who he can trust the least. So it's sort of, he becomes this idea of like a destiny that's catching up with Miles.
Do you think that Miles Morales is such a great character also because the audience can relate to him?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he's a very different, comes from a different place, and he's a different ethnicity than Peter Parker. Miles is, he's a 13-year-old kid from Brooklyn, New York. He's Afro-Latino. He's got both of his parents are still alive. It's very different from Peter Parker. So he's a very different version of Spider-Man. But the thing that makes the movie interesting to me also is that even though he's that different from Peter Parker, the story of Spider-Man still kind of stays the same. The things that were important about Spider-Man when he was Peter Parker behind the mask are the same things that are important behind it when Miles Morales is in the mask. And it just shows how strong that idea of Spider-Man is.
So, about Miles Morales. Miles comes from Marvel Comics. He was introduced in 2011, I think, and he was the first of a wave of iconic characters that were being reimagined with different ethnicities or sexes. It's just the idea, it's kind of remixing. It's like remixing iconic classics to kind of try to see if they can be more relevant or if you can have a different perspective or a new angle on them for a new time. And it's kind of like reinvigorated a lot of these characters while like retaining what makes them great in the first place. Miles is very different from Peter Parker. He's an Afro-Latino kid from Brooklyn. He's 13 years old. His mother and father are both still alive, which is totally different from Spider-Man. He's a very different character with very different concerns and problems. But the important thing is that he still embodies what's important about Spider-Man. I'll get to that a little later. So we're talking about a new Spider-Man for a new time, and that is one of the first ways in which we had to ask the question, well, wait a minute, what story are we telling? So this is kind of the meta part of what story are we telling? How does this movie fit into the world where there's already been tons of Spider-Man movies? Everybody knows about Spider-Man. Everybody knows the story of Spider-Man. Why would anybody want to see this movie? It's kind of the meta. And also, it's an animated movie in a world where there are tons of animated movies. And frankly, one of the greatest animated movies of all time was about superheroes. We just heard that guy talk yesterday about The Incredibles and Incredibles 2. It's like, if you're gonna make an animated superhero movie, you got some stiff competition. So what can you say that's new and different? So in the realm of design, one thing we were really interested in, like I said, we had this idea that we wanted to have a graphic, kind of bold look. We wanted a comic book inspired look. And we were trying to figure out how do we do that with our characters? How does our character design fit into this comic book world? And one thing we did very early on, there's a great sculptor named Andrea Blesic who's worked on tons of animated films. Most of you guys probably know who he is. But he's got a beautiful angular sculptural style. And the great thing that we saw in Andrea's work was an opportunity to introduce more planes into our characters, more graphic planes. So you can see, even in a human figure, there's a real sharpness and angularity to the planes. And what that does, when you light it, it helps you create like bolder, more stark shadows. And in comic books, when an artist is working with India ink and marking out spotting the blacks, that's how you define the form, and it's often very, in a really bold way. So this kind of planar design started working its way into our character design across the board and helped us to achieve a little bit more of that graphic look that we were after. Even we had Shi Kim, who's like one of the greatest character designers working for Disney. He came over and did a lot of beautiful, beautiful character design work for us, very appealing stuff. And he started working in more straight angular lines to kind of start fitting into that design aesthetic with our characters. So that idea was being felt all over the place. Now we spent a long time on the design of Miles, and we actually got to a place where we were really pretty happy with what we had. So this next section is, you gotta say I love you, or you gotta say I love you back. Because we wanted the audience to love Miles. That was our big mission. So how are we gonna do that? We're gonna observe Miles, we're gonna observe his family, we're gonna observe him and his world. So this is like the micro of this new Spider-Man idea. It's like really focusing in on what makes this new Spider-Man character worth following. We're gonna learn all about Miles, we're gonna create his world. We're gonna have you hopefully empathize and fall in love with him, just as much as you did with Peter Parker, the old icon. So this was a very early piece of artwork by the great Alberto Mielgo, who did the first visual development on the movie. And in some ways he set the tone, and his work posed a lot of questions for us that, in answering, we kind of ended up finding our style. So we knew Miles, we knew we had to, tell the audience who didn't know him, well, who is Miles? We knew we wanted him to be contemporary and as much like a 13-year-old kid from Brooklyn now in 2018, 2019 as we could make him, to increase this kind of sense of identification with him and his freshness. He's a new character, but we want you to feel like you know him, like you can walk out your door and meet, a billion kids just like Miles. And as much as, Peter Parker in 1963 felt really new in a world of like, Superman and Batman and whoever else, we wanted Miles to feel just as fresh and just as new. So the early stuff we were seeing by Alberto was super exciting. It was pretty fashion forward, because that's kind of his thing, but it brought a lot of life and a lot of like very contemporary energy to the character. And it was like, well, of course, a 13-year-old, we've got to, 13-year-olds want to look cool, they want to have the latest stuff. They want to be like, they're growing up beyond their years, and there's a certain energy and charm in that we wanted our character of Miles to have. We also, of course, wanted him to be really appealing. That's where Shi-Yun came in, because you had to love him, you had to feel his vulnerability, you had to understand, the challenges that he was facing and want to go on that journey with him. So the quest was to balance the need for charm and appeal with kind of a contemporary edge with Miles. And these are just some really nice, when we had cast Shamik Moore, our lead actor, she started incorporating some little subtle things like, the way the corners of Shamik's mouth worked, and the way his eyes, his eyebrows, the way they kind of operated. Things to kind of like give you little cues as to like this being a real person, this being a real kid. And, attention to real world detail. Miles, we spent endless hours. Well, he goes to a private school. What kind of uniform does he have? What color is the tie? What are the blazers? Is he wearing loafers or is he wearing his Nikes? What's the endless endless permutations of the idea to find something that was going to feel authentic and yet still kind of unique. So the other thing about Miles, the big thing was like, he's a young kid of color, you know, he's a young black kid growing up in Brooklyn, New York, who's going to become Spider-Man. And that's a huge deal because, you know, as we all know, it's a rarity in animated feature film to center on a character who's not white, right? That's been the history of animated film for the past, 80, 100 years. It's very rare when the opposite happens. So we wanted to, we knew that it was going to be an important thing for a lot of people, but the source material already had Miles as a black teen. So the statement, to an extent, was already made, Black Spider-Man. We didn't feel like we had to blow a trumpet to establish that. What we wanted to do was lean into the reality and the detail and the texture of his life to present a portrait of a real kid going through this experience. Once again, for the story, what story are we telling? A new Spider-Man. People have to accept the new Spider-Man the way they did Peter Parker. You've got to open up and empathize and love him. So you've got to be able to relate and feel that he's real. That meant getting into his family. So this is Jefferson, Miles' dad. Miles grows up in like a blue-collar family in Brooklyn, and his dad's a cop, kind of a little bit of a disciplinarian, a little bit strict but very loving, voiced by Brian Tyree Henry, who's just a brilliant actor. With Jefferson, we wanted kind of an imposing figure who was going to be kind of an authority for Miles, but also somebody who was warm and clearly loved him. And so we knew that Miles' family meant the world to him. His mom's a nurse, so in her way, she's like Miles' father, a cop. They're kind of both caregivers, they're both kind of protectors. In that way, they're both role models for Miles, who is also going to go on to do a version of the same thing as a superhero. So that ground is kind of laid already. But it was, she's Puerto Rican, Brooklyn, Puerto Rican, voiced by Luna Velez, who was also Brooklyn, Puerto Rican, so it was fantastic. We had Uncle Aaron, who was the third part of the family dynamic, and there's you guys who have seen the movie, there's a whole triangle between Miles and his father and his uncle. Which path will Miles take? Which influence? And he's receiving important life lessons from both of these men in very different ways, and there's a drama that unfolds. But as well, in Aaron's design, we wanted someone who felt relatable, warm, also full of character, very authentic. You could walk out your door in New York and see 100 guys that look and feel like Aaron. So we wanted to, it was the texture of their life that we wanted to present. We wanted to present incidentally. We didn't want to shine a light on it, but we also didn't want to stray or shy away from the reality. So these characters, they talk like characters would in this world, without it being a parody of how Black or Latino people talk. You hear Spanish spoken by Miles' mom, but it's not translated. There's no subtitles because it's coming from inside their experience. It's just how they live. There's no subtitles when people who speak Spanish speak it in the United States. So there's none in our movie. The ethnic distribution of like the people in Miles' neighborhood and in his school, again, it's kind of an unusual thing to see in at least an American animated feature film, something that feels fresh and new, and yet everyone knows if you walk down certain streets in Brooklyn, certain areas of town, that's what you're going to see because that's what life is like. We wanted it to feel and have the texture of authentic real life in as many senses as we could to increase your identification with this character as being part of your real world.
Which new elements did you want to bring in this new Spider-Man?
I think it was the idea that there was someone new who was going to be Spider-Man. It wasn't the same Spider-Man that we always had known for 50 years and loved. It was somebody new who was going to take up the role, and our job was to make you feel as much for him as you did for Peter Parker, the original Spider-Man. So I think most of our work was in creating Miles and making him someone that the audience would really be able to empathize with and kind of fall in love with, that they would accept him as a new Spider-Man.
Our first impulse was to go back to the source material, comic books. And since we're an animated feature, animation kind of allowed us to embrace the graphic nature of comic books in a way that live action movies can't quite do. It's a very different kind of stylization that we were able to kind of reach for with animation than you could in a live action movie. As great as live action Spider-Man movies are, we just saw, right? No shade, rude. So we thought, let's go to comics, let's go to the source. Let's embrace the things that make comic books unique that you can't get anywhere else and that we haven't seen on screen yet. And those things are like a kind of dynamism. These images, they jump off the page at you. They're bold. Every single image is drawn for you by an artist so that when you're looking at that comic book, it's just that artist talking to you at every single moment with every single panel. It's all there just for you. There's a lot of there's sound effects on the screen. There's word balloons. There's big splash panels. There's other stuff unique to comics. I mean, we really leaned into, of course, our famous little halftone dots that are like all over the place. And it's one of the ways that we were looking at, well, how can we draw on the graphic nature of comic books rather than representing the story purely photographically? How can we use the language of comics to start to say things about the story in the world that set it apart from a normally photographed movie or animated movie? And one of those ways was to, well, let's even render things differently. Let's render light differently. Let's do stuff like this. So you can see here, the colors are extreme to reflect Miles Morales' mental state. The different kinds of patterns and texturing in the shading was something that we wanted to do to give like a kind of a textural, tactile, handmade feel to a lot of the imagery, because a big thing we wanted to do that also goes with comics is to bring back the idea of a handmade feel, that you can feel the hand of the artist. You can see in this process thing all the different layers of what we call the render script, which was the different ways that we had of rendering the surfaces of the image to give a different texture, a different feel, that was taking you a little bit away from pure photographic reality to something that had a little more, felt like an artist maybe was coming up with these decisions and doing it by hand. And that idea of a render script kind of extended to how we would visualize, some of our other characters' worlds. Like Gwen Stacy, her world is rendered in a way that's consistent with the look of the style of her own comic book in the real world. It's a real kind of watercolory look with these bright kind of neon colors. But if you look at Gwen Stacy comic books, this is the world that she inhabits. And we wanted to be able to evoke that world in the movie. So you started getting a sense that, it's like you're at a rack at a comic book store and it's your Gwen Stacy, what's going on with her? Well, I'm looking at this Miles Morales comic book.
What is your personal definition of animation?
Oh, wow. Animation, how would I define it? It's a kind of cinematic storytelling that relies completely on the artist to put an image on the screen. I mean, everything in animation is created by an artist in one way or another. So in that way, it's a very pure form of cinema. You might be able to argue that it's the most expressive form of cinema because it really is drawn by artists one way or the other, and that's the idea we tried to bring to the way we made Spiderverse.
So there's a lot of biz dev of Brooklyn, and Miles' story. It's a story of a kid moving from one environment to another, both in the world and psychologically, leaving home and finding a place. So home, Brooklyn, was warm and pleasant, even though it's not perfect. We strove for a lot of real Brooklyn detail. We also, the other boroughs of New York, like Queens, Manhattan, we also wanted to give them really strong identities. I mean, this movie, we made it a real New York movie. We were able to make it a stylized portrait of a specific city and not a picture of like an Everytown city. It didn't have to be generic. We had the luxury of being able to say, no, we're really focusing on New York in detail. We want to take you to New York in this movie. We don't want to avoid any particular city. And so our keyword was observation. Every detail we could was observed. These photos were taken on an early location scout to pick up as many street details about Brooklyn as we could, the feel of it, the feel of just about everything. The lighting situations, which had, you go to any city, and of course at night it becomes a different place depending on the kind of lighting that you have. It's a whole other level of reality that you can sort of access and observe. And again, it was to present Miles's world as real place as your world, to increase your identification with him. You feel his world. It feels like the one that you're in, and you kind of are him. You're in that world with him. So all of our visitive artwork was kind of like trying to find that balance, the balance of stylization and reality, taking the real of New York and presenting it in this graphic, this expressive way to communicate the feel of the comic book world translation of this. And even stuff like the living environments, you've got the kids' dorm room. It's as much of like an observed dorm room as we could make it. The details, the color, the feel, the light, the size. Uncle Aaron's apartment, with his funky kind of red sofa and all the details that, okay, yeah, I can buy that guy living in Brooklyn would live in this place with video games and his tech and his speakers, and it's got some of the texture of life.
Did the visual style of the movie influence the story in any way?
I think in a way it was really important for the story too, because, it goes back to the idea that this was going to be a new Spider-Man, and everyone, you have to make it very clear that this is something new and different. So we wanted the look to be different. We wanted the feel to be different. We wanted Miles to feel like, a real kid from 2019. We wanted the New York of the movie to feel like, like 2019 New York. So there were a lot of things that we tried to do to make it feel as contemporary and as specific as we could, to make it feel like you're really seeing a kid now becoming Spider-Man, and that kids, a lot of kids in the audience who maybe didn't know that much about Spider-Man could look up at the screen and see somebody who felt like them and who listened to the same kind of music as them and wore the same kind of clothes, and that they could go out their front door and the city looks the same as the city Miles lives in. It was very important to us to make people identify with Miles that way by seeing him as like a real kid now.
Another thing we wanted to bring in comics was the idea of text on screen. So using it as a way to kind of say, okay, this movie is based on a comic book, but also in a story sense, to make it a little more expressive of where Miles is in the moment. Because what we kind of like hit on was, when Miles starts realizing that he has these different weird spider powers, he's entering another world. He's going from being a normal kid to entering the world of Spider-Man. So as he does, that's where these comic book conventions, like the word balloons, start coming in to his reality and his life in a much bigger and broader way. And you kind of see that if you watch the movie again, you'll see in the beginning there's none of that stuff. But after he's bit by the spider, progressively this stuff starts happening more and more. There's also stuff like big sound effects on the screen, just big bold graphics to really like bang in on the moment like you do in a comic book. To really like punctuate and exaggerate and express things in a way that you couldn't normally in a regular movie. I mean, you can, but somehow the aesthetic is tied together in a different way in a movie like this. And everybody's favorite example, oink, the bagel. Also, we had our graphic holds, where we would like just literally pop into a comic book frame at certain times, again, to accentuate the moment. And we'd only hold them for a second, just as like almost as a subliminal effect. But it's kind of a cool way of tying back to the language of comics, and also making something, heightening the moment by making it visually striking. Another thing we leaned into was panelization. This is something that you only see in comic books. I mean, you see it in movies in the form of split screens, but it was something we found that we could use to kind of almost almost tell moments of the movie in kind of a cubist way, where you're seeing different angles and different perspectives on one action at the same time. And again, to maybe it looks cool, but it's also a way to sort of, it's kind of like atomizing a moment. It's a different way of treating time. When you're reading a comic book, you're in control of the flow of time completely. You can turn back the page if you want, or you can linger on a panel a little longer. You can control that in a way you can't really when you're watching a movie, unless you're like constantly winding back and moving the whole thing. But with this panelization idea, we kind of felt like, this is kind of a way to tell people, wait a minute, slow down, be in this moment for a little bit, feel it just a little more. So the build of the moment and the feel of it gets a little extra something that maybe you wouldn't. It's a little surprise. It's something other than a normal series of cuts.
What about the editing of the film, which is also very related to the comic books world?
Again, to make this Spider-Man movie different from all the other Spider-Man movies, we said, well, you know what, let's do something that they couldn't do in the live-action movies, which is really go back to the look and feel of comic books and really make the viewer feel like they were alone in their room reading a comic book that was, drawn just for them. So whatever we could do to give people that feeling, we wanted to try and see if we could recreate that in the movie. And a lot of those techniques, like, seeing the big sound effects on the screen or the panels, all of those things, we wanted to see if we could give the audience the feeling of a comic book.
So the stuff that's really at the heart of Spider-Man movies is, of course, Spider-Man, the idea of Spider-Man, and what the spider characters themselves actually kind of embody. And like I said, with great power comes great responsibility. That idea that goes all the way back to 1963, and the additional idea from our movie, which is anyone can wear the mask. That's kind of the whole reason the whole multiverse idea is in there in the first place. This idea that it can be anyone behind the mask of Spider-Man, but if they can step up to the awesome responsibility and use their powers unselfishly instead of selfishly, then they really are Spider-Man. And here, we had Miles kind of like having to face the legacy of Spider-Man. The world that Miles grows up in it's a lot like the world of our movie being made. It's a world where Spider-Man is already established. There's already a Spider-Man, and everybody knows him. Everyone has an idea of Spider-Man. And suddenly this 13-year-old kid finds himself having to live up to that with no idea of how to do it. And our first Spider-Man that we meet in the movie is actually pretty perfect. He's like an ideal version of Spider-Man. So that's who Miles ends up with. That's the other side of the spectrum from what he was expecting to find. He finds this Peter B. Parker, who was our take to show you, okay, we know what the ideal of Spider-Man is. What might the reality of Spider-Man be? What might it be to be like this hero and shoulder all this responsibility for 20 plus years? What does that do to your life? There's a cost to living your entire life thinking about saving other people, saving the whole city. And Miles had to see that. That was a big part of Miles having to shoulder this new responsibility, was to see the cost of it. So that cost came in the form of this older Peter Parker, who's a few years down the road. He's kind of disillusioned. We thought of him as like an aging athlete who's had a few too many, blown out knees, a few too many dislocated shoulders, divorce. He's not rich. It hasn't given him material success in the real world. He's paid a cost for being a hero. It's about sacrifice. So Peter's kind of a broken character when we meet him. And he and Miles both kind of end up becoming whole people and whole heroes because of their journey together. We also had this idea of you're like me. Every time our spider people meet each other in the movie, they think they're the only one. They spent their whole careers and whole lives thinking they're the only Spider-Man in the entire world. It's just like Miles feels. He feels like he's the only one that has this problem. It's just like any of us feel we're the only ones who have our particular problems. until we happen to meet somebody who has an experience that's like ours, and we can empathize with them, and we realize we're not alone in the world. There's something that we have in common with other people. And so having our other spider characters in the movie, like Gwen, was a way to talk about the universality of some of these ideas of human connection and of the themes of Spider-Man, which are sacrifice and responsibility and resilience. All of our spider people in the movie are bound by those same ideas. So it becomes, what story are we telling? We're telling now the story of a kid who thinks he's alone and discovers that he's got a tribe of other people that he just hasn't met yet. But all these people, they're like him and they're going through the same things. Like Gwen, her story is all about, a character who loses a close friend. She feels like it's her fault. She withdraws from the world. She doesn't do friends anymore. It takes this movie, the story of this movie and meeting Miles, to get her to open up and start interacting with other people and trusting again, opening herself up. We've got our other characters, Spiderman Noir, of course Spider-Ham, Penny Parker, and her wonderful robot. And these guys, they're kind of in the movie again to say, this is Spider-Man, it's a universal idea. It's about the idea of Spider-Man. It's about the idea of the multiverse. So the multiverse is not just a device to bring these characters together. It's kind of a metaphor for all the different possibilities and all the different ways that people can come together despite their differences. And of course, it's all centered around these characters who all have the same kind of basic traumas. They all have the same themes. They find out that their stories are really, really fairly similar, and that allows them to connect. And I do think that's one of the big reasons that this movie has found a place in a lot of people's hearts, because, basically it's about this idea of connection and finding other people who are like you, and that, none of us is really all that much different from the other when you really get down to it. And it's still Spider-Man.
Do you see a bit of your personal life in Miles Morales?
Yeah, sure, to an extent. Yeah, that there was this, there is this idea that whatever movie you're working on, you eventually realize that it's mirroring your life in some way. And yeah, for me, I think definitely the idea of someone who kind of comes together with other people that have the same abilities as him to, work together on some project. It was kind of like the story of the making of Spiderverse. We all kind of came together with our weird powers and abilities to, make this crazy movie. And yeah, and I would say in that way, the way that all of us came, we're all very, all of us who worked on the movie, we're all very different, but we kind of unified to work really, really hard and make the story of Miles.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Disonore su tutta la tua famiglia, prendi nota tu. Disonore su di te, disonore sulla tua mucca,